All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. So let's go over it really quick. Yesterday we were talking about, we were talking about the different kinds of spending that the husband would actually be responsible for spending on the wife. And we talked about the food, we talked about the drinking, we talked about the clothing, and we also talked about the housing and the different cosmetics that probably she may need. And certainly we went in some details talking about, well, that wasn't last time, that was the time before that one, talking about medical coverage and medical expenses, basically. And we also went in talking about, well, how does he actually give her that money? Does he give it to her as in cash? Or is it enough for him to basically, let's say, pay the bills or do what is necessary to probably purchase the groceries, make it available, basically in that way. So this, in short, we said it would basically be done based on the culture. So if the culture requires that he would basically pay it in a specific amount of allowance type of thing, then that's what he's going to do. But most of the cultures is that he basically goes, buys the stuff, or perhaps maybe gives her the money, or maybe the card, the Visa card or credit card or whatever, in order for her to basically purchase the items and basically use those items for the different expenses. And we talked about the timing of when is he obligated to pay all of this, and we said it actually starts from the time of the marriage contract. And then we went into this dispute, when exactly does this actually start, if we're talking about a culture that she's staying at her parents' house till the wedding happens? And what if the wedding happens, then she goes home, and instead of going to her parents' house, I know that the Pakistani culture, I think they do that as well. So there would be a marriage contract, and then they would do something like a little party, but the husband and the wife would stay together at late, I think almost like a week or something, and then she would go to her parents' house, which I think is extremely, sorry, I don't usually speak about any culture, but that piece of culture is absolutely ridiculous. Sorry. Absolutely ridiculous, is nothing but a fitna. I've said it many times. I don't defame certain cultures, but this piece of a culture contradicts the core and the core of Islam, to actually get her back, and that she would start sleeping at her parents' house, even though they had been together for like a week at a hotel, but then she goes to her parents' house. Well, this is the prime time for them to actually start the relationship, and to make this husband basically suffer with his wife being away is absolutely ridiculous and is contradictory to what Islam actually teaches. Absolutely ridiculous. Pakistanis, Indians, please give up on this culture and totally reject it, because this is against the principles and against the legal maxims of Islam. Anyhow, I know it's not all Pakistanis, and I know it's not all Indians, so before anybody tells me, but this is absolutely in contradiction with what Islam teaches. Anyhow, so let's see. We also talked about the expenses that a woman gets, basically let's call it the financial coverage that she would get in case that she was actually a working woman. And we went into the differences of opinions for working women. One, do they get that financial coverage? Do they not get it? And what if she was working part-time? Does she get half the financial coverage? What if they were, I guess, consenting, agreeing on a certain thing? Does that mean at least it solves a dispute? So just to note, and of course, the majority of the scholars said, majority of the scholars, okay, if she is working, she has her own income, that she should be spending from her own income basically on herself, and that the husband is not obligated to spend on her. Just a note, okay, because I know that there are many Muslim feminists, even though I consider that as an oxymoron, but I know know that many are out there. Just letting you know, if you want to study fiqh, just letting you know that fiqh-wise, majority of the scholars actually said if you are working, you've got your own income, then you can use that income. And of course, majority of the scholars that that would bring the inference that if she is not working, then she is to have the financial coverage basically by 100%, which would include housing, of course, would include, I guess, things like auto insurance, and we're talking about perhaps maybe utility bills, food expenses, clothes, and all of those things that we had mentioned before. And we also talked about, even though we were supposed to be delaying it later, but we also talked about, is a woman that is working obligated to invest some of her income to basically cover expenses within the household. And we talked about the different fractions. And just a note, we basically did talk about the fractions, but I was hoping, down the road, we're going to talk about that even more. But just letting you know that the Hanafi was probably the clearest and probably the strongest, that it's all based on the agreement and that there is no text. Just keep that one in mind. There's no text actually specifying or considering the amount that she would have to invest from her income within the household, and it was all within the parameter of ijtihad. What is ijtihad? Ijtihad is basically the scholars, I guess, the scholars take on it, their evaluation, I guess their own definition of what would be a fair estimate, and not necessarily something that is within the text. And of course, there's this area of how they see it, and then they'll support it, of course, not just by their own mind and what they think would be a fair estimate, but there would also be some reference that they might actually take, even if it's an indirect evidence, but they might actually go to some textual evidence to, I guess sometimes it's an indirect evidence, but they will still use it in order to support their opinion. But of course, looking at all those fractions that especially al-Madhhab al-Maliki debated, there's really no evidence on any of those fractions, not the third, not the half, not the 2/3, and certainly, not the whole. All of those fractions, they basically did not really have any evidence, and that's why the Hanafi went into a complete, I guess, explanation, and also made it short. And he said, you know what, why are we even laying out fractions that don't actually have any evidence? So let's just say, well, let them decide and let them agree on something, and we can use that as the reference, which I thought was actually outstanding. So for the working sisters, please discuss this before you even get married, to know and to basically eliminate every single dispute that might come down the road. Because for sure, if you're bringing in your own personal income, all of that was actually said in those motivational speeches and all of that she doesn't have to pay a single penny, is actually in fiqh books, is not true. It is not true. It is the Hanbali madhab alone that said that she does not have to pay a penny even if she is working. But I'll tell you, when it comes to money, you will see people being selective in the madhab that they basically embrace, or the opinion. And of course, with this selectiveness, it's basically going to be what would support my interest, and you're going to be surprised how people will change when it comes to money. Okay, this is where we left off at, which is حكم نفقة الزوجة الناشز. Let me first explain when we say the ruling on spending on the wife that is nashes. Let me explain the word nashes first. And of course, the word nashes means that she's disobedient to her husband, or basically she is wanting to create a revolution against him. But let me just explain one thing. How much of obedience is the wife supposed to be giving to her husband? Like, how much? What if he says, bring me a cup of water? Or he says, you can't go out till you take my permission. Or something like, stay standing. I don't want you sitting down. Or something like, I want you to stay quiet. Do not argue with me. How much of obedience does she have to comply with? That's the question. Okay. Generally speaking, there isn't a specific parameter. There isn't a specific boundary. It differs from one person to another and from one circumstance to another. And you could see that the ahadith were giving me more of a comprehensive statement than actually detailed to tell me exactly how specific we're being, and we're requesting that the woman would be obedient to her husband. In general, you do see a hadith giving me comprehensive clarifications to tell me things such as going out the house, things such as doing sunnahs that would, let's say, that would contradict probably husband's needs. Maybe perhaps if she wanted to fast, don't fast unless you would get your husband's permission on the days that he probably is in need for her. Because remember, it's haram to be intimate while she is fasting. That's ABC. Right? We know that piece of it, especially in Ramadan. Of course, it would be haram to even accept. Then she would have to say, absolutely not, no matter what. But what if he forces her? He would be at sin. She would not be at sin. Okay. Number three, we also talked about the sunnah. And of course, in that situation, is it permissible to break the fast because of the husband's desire, etc.? Then we'll just make the story short, at least in understanding the parameter. So we speak about one, cannot leave without her husband's permission, unless there was a necessity. I don't know, house is burning down, she wasn't safe, then that's a different story. Okay. Number two, doing a sunnah only with a husband's permission. Number three, of course, in general, the hadith were very comprehensive, telling us to obey the husband. But of course, you would see the different stories basically rising in the amount of obedience. So some were extremely obedient. And, there was a book. There was a book that was or not only one book, but I guess there were a number of different books. Sifat al-Safwa. Maybe I'll talk about that later, but Sifat al-Safwa, and sometimes some of these books can really exaggerate in some women. Sifat al-Safwa wasn't just about women, but it had a whole chapter for women and a number of different chapters, of course, for men. But some of those chapters and talking about women's obedience to their husbands was probably definitely exaggerated in how much of that obedience is to be that committed wife. Okay. So in general, I will say number four, I'm not saying be an obedient person to the point that you're eliminating that person's humanity. And that's why la darar wa la dirar, a legal maxim. There can be no harm. So if the husband is wanting to harm the wife, then in that situation, she can say objection. She can say, objection, you really crossed your borders. This is going beyond your perimeter. I'm not going to do it. And therefore, basically, she would not be held accountable if this is basically causing harm. What kind of harm are we talking about? We're talking about, let's say, we're talking about religious harm. He's asking you to do something haram. Absolutely do not obey. لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق. If he's asking you to do something haram, do not obey. Number two, if it's harming you physically, do not obey. If it's harming you mentally, do not obey. If it's harming you, of course, with your chastity sexually, do not obey if it's harming you. And if he's probably going outside of his borders financially, he's trying to take your money, do not obey. It's your money. If you want to give it to him, that's up to you. But if he's trying to trespass and trying to ask you to sell your gold so he can invest it and you don't want to sell your gold, sorry, but this is blackmail. Do not obey if you do not want to. And therefore, he would be trespassing his borders. And just keeping in mind, if you would see those cases, most of the cases that come as victims, they put themselves in those positions where they did not learn or they were not strong in letting their perpetrators know when to stop. Okay? Just keep that one in mind. They didn't know how to tell their perpetrators when to stop, and they ended up basically being those victims. So it's very important. Yes, this is not a feminist speaking, but this is actually talking about Islam basically letting you know that there are certain points that you basically do not obey if this is bringing you harm from the start, or if the trajectory is going to take you into harm. If this is going to take you into harm, well, from the very start, say, this is going to lead to harm. Sorry, no obedience here. And knowing your religion is actually part of your protection, because most of the abusers, keep that one in mind, most of the abusers and most of the perpetrators actually choose religious women because they basically want someone that is obedient. They want somebody that is obedient. They want somebody that is easily controlled, somebody that they can, especially if we're talking about a cult. If we're talking about a cult, they will basically use these obedient women by convincing them that it was a divine command, and therefore they'll play on the religious tune to basically control these women. So you see the Mormon cults, you see Sufi cults, you see Jewish cults, you'll see all of that. You will see that most of the victims were actually women, and not only that, but they were the ones to also facilitate more and more victims. Why? They thought that they were doing service to God. They were doing a service to the divine. They were doing basically the help, and that makes her better. That basically would give her advancements, etc. When in reality, she basically is just facilitating more and more harm to herself and to others. But I mean, just saying, just keeping that. Now, when I say nushuz, and I purposely said and talked about the areas that Islam tells you not to be obedient in, or gives you at least the right to not be obedient within that area. All right. This is in order to make sure that we understand nushuz right. What is a nushuz? And nushuz is basically when she would disobey him, but I want you to look at this wording right there. He said, فِيمَا لَهُ عَلَيْهَا, from what she has a duty to obey him in. مِمَّا أَوْجَبَهُ لَهُ النِّكَاحِ, from what marriage and marriage contract and the definition of marriage in Islam had basically obligated that she would obey in. And certainly, this is very important to understand, because Islam does not whatsoever tell you to put yourself in a place of harm or to obey if anybody is harming you, and in that situation, object. Now, how to object, that's a different story. Should I object by being strong and basically authoritative, or should I object nicely, or what different methods should I use? I will say, depends on the person that is in front of you. For some certain people, this is not talking about, father and mother. This is not talking about parent, but this is talking about certain people. It depends on who they are. Sometimes you need to start with using the gentle ways, perhaps maybe communicating this. Sorry, but I'm not I'm not going to do this. This is harming me. I will not obey, or probably sometimes acting stupid and not doing it. Okay. And basically ignoring the whole thing. And sometimes using method three, which basically is letting the person know that, you know what, I know you asked me for this, but I'm still not going to do it. And basically ignoring. And then they're probably going to yell it out, just tell them, you know what, thanks for yelling, but guess what? I'm still not going to do it. You can use all your technique, and then that way this person will know that they had trespassed their boundaries. And of course, the final method is to say, I'm telling you, looking them at the in the eye, I'm not going to do it no matter what. And then finally, probably if we're talking about something that is dangerous, probably then saying, I will, in that situation, ask for a divorce if you are going to further pressure me to do what is harmful or to do what is against the deen. Then in that situation, you basically are not considered nashes because they are the ones that are putting you in the perimeter that they don't have the power to put you in. Okay, just keeping that one in mind. All right, so knowing those parameters is key. We'll be, inshallah, maybe talking about that one day, but of course, just letting you know that is not nushuz. In nushuz would, well, literally, it basically means anything that is beyond. So we're talking about a hill. We're talking about anything that basically is, I guess, objecting how when something is smooth. That's basically a nushuz. Okay, and the reason why she was called neshes is because one, she probably maybe he called her to bed and she insisted that she doesn't want to, or probably left the house when he said, do not go, took the keys and just went away. And she said, you know what? I need some time off. And basically, who knows, probably goes to coffee or something. But at the end of the day, is that she left without her husband's permission, or probably said, you know, I'm not moving to that house, and insisted that she wants to move to a different house, or probably, you know, he wants to travel somewhere else. And she said, you know what? I'm not going to travel unless there was an agreement in the marriage contract that she basically had written that she would not depart the country that her family is living in. Then in that situation, she basically can refuse to travel with him. All right. So if it isn't within these parameters, then in that situation, she would not have the right to ask if she basically disobeys, does not have the right for that financial maintenance, not even housing, not even pay for housing, according to the majority of the scholars. So we're talking about different names of scholars. You're talking about the most famous, Malik. Of course, these are actually famous as well, but of course, just wanted to note. And when you say Ashab al-Ra'i, we're talking about the Madhab Hanafi. So, you know, this is just to say. And of course, Il-Hakam right there, you got another scholar basically said, actually, she will always have, so this is a second opinion, she will always have the right for maintenance. And of course, you would see Ibn al-Mundhir. Let me explain why he wanted to note Ibn al-Mundhir, which is the right timing to note him. Ibn al-Mundhir, he basically had put in the effort to collect whenever there is a unanimous agreement between scholars on a matter. He basically wrote a book called Al-Ijma'. So whenever there's that consensus on something, he'll basically note it down. So he wanted to say, well, I do know a considerable scholar. His name is Al-Hakam. I don't want to right now talk about him in details, but he basically objected to it. And because he's a considerable scholar, all right, uh, because he's a considerable scholar, then in that situation, that probably breaks that consensus because he's a considerable scholar. And of course, his evidence, but of course, he said, لَعَلَّهُ, he's not sure if that's his evidence, but he probably, according to Ibn al-Mundhir, he said he's not really sure, but he probably based I guess objection is that if that doesn't take away her mahar, then why should that take away her right in financial maintenance? Which is a very strong objection if that is really what his evidence were. Okay, let's see. What did the majority of the scholars actually say when he says, "Walana"? Well, that actually means that the majority of the scholars, which the author is also in support of. And he said, well, the whole object of nafaqa and basically the financial spending and covering all the spending is really because it is in compensation for her basically being a wife within the household with all its details, with everything that what we mean by a wife. And since she basically had refused to basically submit as a wife, well, in that situation, if the whole object of covering all the expenses was to be a wife to him and she is refusing, well, that means why am I going to be paying for you when you're not being what the whole money compensation was made to cover for? And in other words, this is to trade this for this. I'm basically covering all the expenses in a trade of you being available to me as a wife, as a mother to my children. Then why, if you choose not to do this, so then why am I going to be responsible for your financial coverage? So that's basically their evidence. And they said, as for in objection to what, of course, might have been the evidence that al-Hakam had used, he said, well, the mahr was actually a duty even before any intimacy had happened, and therefore that one was different, because if just by having a marriage contract she would have the right for the mahr, then that's completely different than the nafaqah. In other words, he wanted to say that the analogy in using the same evidence on the mahr, he said you're applying two different things. You're basically stretching out your evidences to completely two different things that are not relevant. Okay, so let's see. And you could say Dardir, who's actually a very important Maliki scholar, he said that the Malikis also. Now, one thing is that for Malikis, they can be very, very detailed in their evidence, and it's so sad that I would say that the Maliki madhab didn't really get the attention that it did, that it really needed. Not that it did, but it didn't get the attention that it really deserved. And for a number of different reasons why the Maliki wasn't actually as famous. Number one is that financial issues. Of course, the Hanbali basically got the financial support from the Gulf countries, and that's why it became something that was very famous. The Hanafi got its fame from the government of an Uthmani government, basically considering it as the basis for the constitution. But the Maliki, I guess it stayed located within North Africa, and that's why one, it didn't have the money to basically have this sponsorship. You want to keep in mind, for ilm, there needs to be financial sponsorship. So for al-madhab al-maliki, because there was no financial sponsorship for that madhab, you could see it became very localized within North Africa, despite the richness of ilm, despite the richness of reference that is in al-madhab al-maliki. Things are changing, but still, I would say we definitely need more sponsors to sponsor al-Madhab al-Maliki, whether inviting students to probably study at the Maliki scholars, or whether it's inviting the Maliki scholars and supporting them by giving them perhaps the media, or probably giving them the tools, or probably hiring the different people to basically support these Maliki scholars and give them basically the available resources to help this madhab basically be out there, because it definitely has a lot of solutions that we definitely right now need. Yet, a note to mention, a lot of the Western laws, specifically in France, actually go back to the madhab Maliki. I know this is really weird for many of you, but yes, a lot of it goes to the madhab Maliki. And of course, the Algerians, Tunisians, Moroccans that lived in France. And certainly, of course, when the French basically also colonized a lot of the North African countries, they had adopted and learned a lot of the fiqh there and basically brought it to the West. And certainly, you would say the constitution there is dependent by a lot in its content, basically on the madhab Maliki. Okay, now let's see. What did he say? He said that the husband, if he is capable. So now you could see madhab al-Maliki wanted to give, I guess, further explanation, and he said, well, if he's capable of returning her, even if that was by the court order, then in that situation, she would basically have the right for a nafaqah. Okay, so now al-Madhab al-Maliki is saying, well, we don't want to drop all the money that she basically may need for maintenance right away. But if he knew that most likely that the court order is going to say, sorry, dear, but you don't really have an objection right there, and that she's pretty much a woman that will listen to the court order, then definitely pay that nafaqah. But if, for example, she had support from her family and that, she was being, I guess, patriotic to her family, and she said, you know what, I'm not going to listen to the court order and I'm not going to take that, then in that situation, and of course, you saw and he saw that most likely that she's just going to basically reject and she's not going to accept whatsoever, and that she's going to be a stubborn woman and that she's going to have her family support on this, then in that situation, he can not, according to the Maliki madhab, basically, based on his evaluation, basically pay for the finances. Okay, let's see. Ibn Abd al-Barr, a very important Maliki scholar, Hafiz al-Maghrib, he basically said that the nushuz would be terminated as a description. This is extremely important. If this woman was actually pregnant, if she is pregnant, and let's say she was being disobedient and she was doing, she was basically objecting to her husband, if she is pregnant, she would still get financial maintenance if she is pregnant. Wait a minute, why if she is pregnant? Because, of course, the baby has the right, even when he is not born yet, he has the right for financial maintenance. Then in that situation, of course, you're not going to be able to give the baby food and exclude the mom. Sorry, things don't work that way. Or probably give the baby shelter without giving her the shelter. Or probably give, I guess, the different maintenance for the baby without giving it to the mom. The mom is containing the baby. It's that simple. So therefore, you have no option but to contain the mother in order to contain the baby. Okay, so that's why Ibn Abd al-Barri basically said, okay, you see that wild card of nashes that you held up? Well, that would basically be nullified, and that would basically be an abandoned card in the situation when she is pregnant. And certainly, let's see right there. And he says, quote, وَمَنْ نَشَزَتْ عَنْهُ امْرَأَتُهُ بَعْدَ دُخُولِهِ بِهَا سَقَطَتْ عَنْهُ نَفَقَتُهَا إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ حَامِلًا. This is the quote. And whoever has a wife that basically had decided to, I guess, revolt against him after he was intimate with her, then in that situation, she would lose her right for finances unless she was pregnant. And let's see what, of course, the author said. He said, وَهَذَا تَقْيِيدٌ صَحِيح. And he said, and this is actually a preponderant or an accurate taqyid. Taqyid is like limitation or condition, because, of course, because the child and paying for the child is the father's obligation. And certainly it is impossible to basically have the baby get whether the food, the housing, the comfort, blah, 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 all these different things, except unless that is the father would cover all of this. And here's the reference right there. Let's continue right there. Okay, well, who's the one that's going to assign how much is the right amount for nafaqah? Who's going to assign that? Well, number one, all right, number one, it's basically the culture itself. That's number one reference. So we're talking about al-ma'ruf 'urfan kal-mashruti shartan. We would basically look at the culture, and the culture is going to define the amount of I guess finances and what is to be covered based on the culture. So let's say in a place like America, it's going to be completely different than probably if this was a Bedouin woman. You know, I know this is going to sound really funny, but we had a Bedouin. I went to the ranch that we used to live in as a child, and there was a Bedouin woman that was basically living next to the ranch that I was visiting, which is basically the old ranch that I lived in as a child. So my mom decided, who was very, very extroverted, she basically decided, let's go and visit the Bedouins that are living there. So I'm like, okay, that's an adventure. Let's go and check it out. I had no clue how Bedouins were living, really. So I visited there with my mom. And of course, I was about 22 years old, somewhere around there. And the Bedouin woman, who's basically, an older woman, she basically put her eyes on me and she said, she would be a perfect wife, a perfect second wife for my son. And my mom, she didn't know how to respond, but she said, but you guys, your life circumstances are different than our life. And she said, don't worry, we'll basically build her a tent right up there on the hill. We'll build her a tent, and plus we'll give her 60 goats to milk, and we'll basically make sure that she also has some water jugs, and she'll also have space to take care of her sheep and all of that. And we'll teach her how to make bread on fire and all of that. And my mom was trying to explain to her that we don't know how to live these circumstances, and we don't know how to do all of this, and that she's basically trying to get her education. And she said, don't worry, I basically had my father put a condition that I would complete my education. So we asked her, like, how much of an education did you get? And she said, I learned how to count to 30. That was the amount of education that she got. And she said, okay, so, but my daughter's going to college. And she said, I'm not sure what you're doing looking at black scribbling things on a piece of white paper. If she were to get more kids, and if she were to get kids, that would actually be a lot more beneficial than looking at black scribbles and on some white paper. That's really wasting the time. So yeah, this is just an idea of, yeah, probably if maybe I was living on that hill with 60 goats, and maybe the 60 goats would have by now, let me see, I'm 46 right now, would have probably multiplied. Let me see how long. Yeah, I would have probably been, I don't know, a great rich woman right there with maybe, I don't know, 3,000 sheep. Maybe I should have chosen that life. Oh, well. Well, too late. All right, let's see. All right, let's see. The Prophet ﷺ, of course, would teach us right there, Hind Mra'at Abi Sufyan, Hind, Abu Sufyan's wife. Okay. Who's Abu Sufyan? Abu Sufyan was basically one of the chieftains. Okay. Was one of the chieftains in Quraysh. Okay. And yet to his wife, Hind bint Utbah. Just an idea. Hind bint Utbah. You're not talking about anybody here, just any random person, but you're talking about Utbah was considered a chieftain himself, one of the richest men in Mecca, to later be one of the key figures in opposing the Prophet ﷺ. But anyhow, that was Hind. Hind later became Muslim. Remember in the Message movie, there was that woman that was basically the key figure that was supporting Abu Sufyan? That's basically her. Okay, and let's say, and she basically had come to the Prophet ﷺ objecting that her husband Abu Sufyan was a cheap husband and that he wasn't spending enough. And by the way, I forgot to mention that Hind is also the mother of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, to later be the Khalifa after the Khulafa al-Rashidin and basically be the key figure for Dawla al-Umayyah. Okay, that's basically right there for Bani Umayyah. Okay, let's see. So the Prophet ﷺ, after Hind complains to the Prophet ﷺ about Abu Sufyan, the Prophet ﷺ says the following: خذي ما يكفيك وأهدك بالمعروف. Take what is enough for you and your children, and considering bil ma'ruf. So in that situation, we're going to look at ma'ruf. One, have integrity and have that transparency. Don't exceed the limit of what really is making sense. Of course, you would be shopping and your husband doesn't really know what spices and what name brands and what probably you're putting in that cart, but you have to do that. You would have to have the integrity to make sure that you are using that money in a way that is basically compatible. Let's use that word, compatible with his financial capabilities. Of course, he might go probably shopping on your behalf, but of course, you as a woman that's going to be cooking, you would know, I need this. This is a better quality. This one, I tried it before. The kids didn't like it. This one, of course, as a woman, you basically have to use a level of, let's say, decency, a level of integrity, a level of basically consideration to what your husband can afford, in order to make sure that you are not abusing the fact that he's probably giving you the money and then abusing, perhaps, maybe, well, he's the one that chose to get married, so there, and basically making him in debt, or probably him finding himself that, someone else is choosing to retaliate by abusing the finances and abusing that way. So remember, do not let your shaitan basically overcome you and tell you, retaliate by using basically his money. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, bil ma'ruf. And if the husband is unaware of your retaliation, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be holding you accountable for each and every single penny. Be prepared. So therefore, before you even prepare yourself for accountability, make sure you prepare yourself for at least integrity. Just keep that one in mind. Okay, now, when you say bil ma'ruf, that also differs when we're speaking about one culture to another. Certainly, if you are a Bedouin, all you need is probably a beautiful tent right there. Don't worry, they'll allow you to put flowers if that's what you want, and perhaps maybe more than one jug of water for the bathroom usage. Well, we'll make sure that there's a hill nearby for you to do your business. So if that's a Bedouin, okay. But if you basically are probably a different culture, maybe, of course, be prepared to use squat bathrooms. And yeah, maybe it'll take some training, but trust me, you really need good knee joints to work on that. And probably, I don't know, is AC included? Is it not included? What about car? Is car and auto insurance, is that also included? So that depends really on al-ma'ruf. And certainly al-ma'ruf, we're talking about two things. Okay, we're talking about culture, and we're also talking about his financial capabilities. Okay. A financial capability that he's probably perhaps maybe in the upper class and he's capable of affording such expenses. Other times, well, he's probably not capable of affording that. So then you would need to be economical, at least in the way that you are spending, to make sure that you don't eventually pay the price, you and your kids, probably, for not, considering the economical financial management that is necessary in order for you guys to move on. And certainly, one family might actually need, perhaps maybe you've got teenage boys, and when you have teenage boys, be prepared, because they are basically just a food consumption machine. They'll basically get hungry when you were like, why just put dinner? You do know that. And they'll be like, yeah, I don't know how, but it got absorbed and you start putting more and more food and then it vanishes. You don't know if their stomachs have leaks in them or whatever, but definitely that food basically just vanished in their stomach. And yeah, you wonder if they even digested it or whether it just went inside and just boom, vanished right there right away. So yeah, definitely. And compare it to probably, younger children. We're talking about toddlers. They definitely don't need the same amount, perhaps maybe as teenage boys. So in that situation, the amount that probably is needed to cover, the amount that you need to cover in expenses, whether we're speaking about food or whether we're speaking about clothes or whether we're speaking about shoes, we're talking about basically general maintenance. It really differs from one family, from one child, from, the expenses do vary. It's not like every single month that they come with a total amount due, and it's not necessarily, a fixed price necessarily, because one day you might actually have somebody getting sick, another day they might actually need maybe a field trip to go to or whatever. So expenses can sometimes vary. Let's see, right here is Sarakhsi. Sarakhsi, just a note, السرخسي شمس الدين السرخسي. Shamsuddin al-Sarakhsi, from his name, you could see Shamsuddin, his name was going to be Ahmad. Of course, Shamsuddin means Ahmad, just like Salahuddin means Yusuf, Izzuddin means Mas'ud. But anyhow, al-Sarakhsi right there is one of the Hanafi scholars. He basically wrote al-Mabsut, which is in 20 volumes, 21, within those areas of volumes, and a very important book for al-Madhhab al-Hanafi. And this is what he said. He said, that the amount that would basically be set. So we're talking about how do we set the amount? He said, ما تقع به الكفاية. What really would be considered is giving the amount of satisfaction or the amount necessary. That's the consideration that we're going to be using in understanding, well, what is al-ma'ruf? What do you mean by al-ma'ruf? So we're basically looking at al-Sarakhsi, and he's saying, well, in order to basically consider al-ma'ruf, we're talking about the needs, we're talking about the wants, we're talking about, well, what is necessary, and is it going to be basing it perhaps on buying maybe from store A or store B, what really is necessary here? Then we would basically here consider ويعتبر المعروف في ذلك فوق التقدير ودون الإسراف. Here we go. Gave a general statement, and he said what would be considered as al-ma'ruf, where one, it is beyond being cheap and not exceeding the limit. Now, here's one thing. When you say exceeding the limit and being cheap, again, we might actually have differences of opinions, and that's why you had the scholars debate on, well, what really is considered cheap? What really is considered overspending? What one person might actually consider that as good money management. Another person might actually consider it, sorry, but you're being over cheap. That's not money management, but you're being over cheap. So, well, money management is really going to be this kind of, I guess, parameter and this kind of meter that we're going to be basically using depending on the person's financial capabilities. Okay. Depending on the person's financial capabilities, and that's going to determine a lot. So in that situation, if you're not fully aware of the husband's financial capabilities, then in that situation, perhaps communicate it in order to understand where your parameters are. Communicate it out and have this religious integrity, have the taqwa in how to maintain the household without exaggerating in putting perhaps a burden, a financial burden on your husband, but just be fair. And remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically oversee what you are spending and what you are actually doing and will hold you accountable. All right. Now, the scholars actually went in lots of debate, like I said, in what really is obligatory in terms of food expenses, in terms of clothing, what really is the limit. And certainly, they do have very good details in discussing certain details. I would say a lot of those details we can benefit from because those details certainly they were within the dynamic of their life, but not necessarily the dynamic of our life right now. And you could see right there, that's why he's objecting. And he said, well, it was actually based on their culture. This is what he's saying. He said it's actually based on their culture during that time. And the circumstances had changed a lot during our times, and every single time of the every single time, every single area, every single basically class has their own definition and their own evaluation of what actually makes a fair pay and what makes an exaggerated pay. So then we would basically consider al-urf, we would consider basically the culture at that time. And of course, the scholars had a lot of ijtihadat. When we say a lot of ijtihadat, they had their own evaluation and they had a lot of their own inference of what they understood, whether we're speaking about perhaps, I know this one's really, ironic during our times, ujrat al-hammam. There's a certain price for a bathroom. No, this isn't talking about a bathroom. This is talking about a shower. So yes, the showering, it was kind of like a spa, kind of like a Moroccan shower. They'll basically do 7 layers of showering, one with, I don't know what kind of mud, another one with probably, some kind of soap, and another one with, scrubbing, and another one. It's like 7 layers of different showering for a Moroccan shower. So that one's quite interesting. And guess what? They even charge for it. Moroccan showers or Moroccan, I don't know, spas, they actually charge. And yeah, does he have to pay for this spa? Okay, of course. Does he have to pay for this spa? And of course, certainly, at that time, they didn't consider it necessarily a luxury, but they considered it a necessity. And I know you're going to say, but isn't there a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, "Man kana tu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir, fala tadkhul al-hammam"? All those hadith are actually not authentic, but that is not to mean that it is permissible to enter those spas where, of course, women are uncovering, but you basically have to take in consideration cameras, got to take in consideration that this woman is mu'tamana, and that got to take in consideration basically to stay within the limit that Islam allowed, and got to take in consideration basically that other women are not uncovering. So if we're talking about a spa, whatever the details are, later inshallah to be discussed. And of course, we're talking about the scholars basically had, again, lots of ijtihadat if you're buying different kinds of fruits and or probably different kinds of, I guess, cosmetics. And of course, you'll see that they basically had differences of opinions based on what is considered a necessity. What is considered a necessity, of course, for woman A might not be a necessity for woman B. If we're talking about perhaps maybe we're talking about maybe cosmetics. A sister with coarse hair might actually need certain oils, might need certain braids, might need certain, I guess, hair maintenance that perhaps a sister that is probably, I don't know, Japanese and with very silky hair, etc., she probably doesn't need the same, but probably needs, I don't know what kind of cuts they could do other than bob cuts, but whatever. Right. And in the end, of course, this maintenance for sisters, that sister's hair probably needs oils, or probably needs certain maintenance that definitely costs more, that wife B might not actually require. But she probably needs something else. Maybe suntan lotion, or probably the other sister might not need suntan lotion. MashaAllah, she was actually given organic, she was built in suntan lotion. This sister, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically given her a built-in coverage protection from basically the sun rays. So, one person to another basically differs. So in that situation, the husband is also going to be responsible to making sure that he is being fair in covering basically the needs, whether we're speaking about cosmetics, or whether we're speaking about fruits, or whether we're speaking about perhaps maybe other luxurious maybe coverage. All of that, it basically depends on the need, of course, the need and the wants, and whether, of course, this is for the husband, or whether it's basically just a plus and a luxury just for her own self. All right. And of course, there's this one. This one's quite tricky. This one's quite interesting as well, that the scholars actually had differences of opinions. Who is going to be the center that we're going to be using in order to define whether this is it her culture, or is it his culture that we're going to be using? His definition. Is it his financial capabilities, or her financial capabilities, or both of them? Or are we going to do the average? So that's why, that debate. And remember, let me give you, for example, I guess a scenario for this. All right. Let's say it was a big one. I think that it was watching this documentary the other day of this, I think she was American, that was married to one of these tribes in Ethiopia. I know those tribes that jump high. What are they called? Forgot what they were called. What? No, I forgot what they were called. Ethiopian tribes.
Asaya,
There you go. There you go. Those ones. And she was married to him, and then I guess the marriage didn't work out later on, but she lived in that tribe, and basically in Africa for a couple years. But of course, the culture is completely different. The whole lifestyle of, she tried to, I guess, live with them for quite a while, but then things didn't work out. And of course, that was inevitable, I guess. But she described their life with them, and how things were. But certainly, if you're talking about a woman that is, a Western woman, to basically live this simple life in basically this rural side of Africa. And it wasn't any place in Africa. I mean, you can be living in probably, in a Nairobi, or probably, certain cities in Africa, and they would be very upper class, that even a place in the West would not even have that type of luxury. I mean, here in Malaysia, you'll see certain areas that have way higher luxury than probably places in California. Okay. But, and at the end, what do we consider? Do we consider his culture, or do we consider her culture? Okay. Now let's see right there. For the Madhab al-Hanbali, they considered that, no, we're going to consider both of them. We're going to consider both the husband and the wife. And if both of them were basically living a luxurious life, then in that situation, well, then he was also an upper class husband, then he would basically have to spend like a luxurious family. But if both were basically considered as the middle class, then in that situation, we would basically consider a middle class spending. So we would look at a middle class spending. What is the average for a middle class spending of a family of 3 or 2 or whatever it is? And then we would say, well, this is the average. If you're paying more, then that means you have to lessen on your expenses, and you basically have to pay less. Then you have to figure out, okay, which one of these expenses should we eliminate in order to make sure that we're not crossing the limit of what we really can probably handle. And of course, if one was let's say rich, upper class, and the other one was basically a lower class, then in that situation, we'd basically take that moderation and not to upper class and not to lower class. Okay, then in that situation, just keep that one in mind. And that was the Hanafi's opinion as well. Let's see, for the Hanafi opinion, let's say for the Hanafis and what they considered is going to be considered, they basically said, and right there, away, okay, في النفقة حال الزوج في اليسار والإعصار. For the Hanafis, they said, no, what we're going to consider is the husband and his financial capabilities. Why? They said, well, we've got an evidence that the ayah says, لِيُنْفِقْ ذُو سَعَةٍ مِّن سَعَتِهِ. Let each one basically spend, and we're speaking about if he's rich, basically spend as a rich person, and whoever is poor, basically, they would spend based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. So in other words, there's no sense that what she is demanding is necessarily going to be what we're going to consider as the reference, because we're going to go back to basically he's the one that's going to be paying. So that's the Hanafi. I really think that would make sense and that would be fair, because if she's going to be saying, well, this is how much I want to spend, but then he can't afford it, that makes no sense. We're not going to put him in debt because she basically had said, well, that's what I'm used to buying. I'm used to buying these kind of cereals. I'm used to buying organic foods. I'm used to buying, I guess, from this rich store. And therefore, we're going to consider what she wants. And then he's saying, well, wait a minute, but I can't afford these kind of stores. I can't afford this kind of luxury. Even though for Ibn Taymiyyah, he basically said, well, sorry, mister, if you had known that she was an upper class girl and that she was used to this kind of a luxurious life, why did you get married to her in the first place? And we'll hold him accountable and say, it's your responsibility. Next time, well, if there is going to be a next time, but anyhow, all right, just keep in mind with that one. But at the end of the day, for Hanafi madhab, they said, we're going to consider his financial capabilities and his capacity in order to judge what would make a fair spending and what would make a fair money management. And certainly in that situation, you would say even another ayah basically saying, على الموسع قدره, the one that basically has the capacity to pay based on their capabilities. But here's one thing. Let's just assume that the husband is capable of, let's say, buying, from an upper class store. But he said, well, looking at the situation, if we continue living this kind of lifestyle 10 years from now, what if looking at the numbers, the money that we're making, nothing is going into savings. Everything is by the end of the month, it's basically spent by 100%. He said that this can any minute actually shift and can put us probably, bankrupt, can put us probably in deficit because we're overspending. Even if we are rich, that doesn't mean that we would be overspending or spending everything that we are making. We have to have an amount to be put within savings, because with this type of luxurious spending, one day we're going to basically find ourselves in deficit. So we basically decided that, okay, this is what we need to do as in money management, and we're going to reduce it. But she objected, but wait a minute, you have the money. Who knows? إِصْرَفْ مَا فِي الْجَيْبِ يَأْتِيكَ مَا فِي الْغَيْبِ, she said. Spend what is in your pockets. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring you the money later on. Don't worry about it. And he said, well, wait a minute. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, اِعْقَلْ وَتَوَكَّلْ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet ﷺ said, اِعْقَلْ وَتَوَكَّلْ. The Prophet ﷺ said, you tie the camel, and then you depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It makes no sense for us to not know and not be prepared for any turnout that might actually surprise us, and without us realizing things changing. Okay, let's see. So this ayah basically in these two ayat basically considered that the reference and what we would consider is basically consider it as our meter, I guess. financial meter. What do we call that? A financial meter? What do they call that? Anyhow, that it's basically going to be dependent on what the husband can afford. And certainly you could see that this basically Maliki and Shafi'i as well, they basically said that. I think it's a question. I'm not going to go into this one too much, but what if he basically was not spending enough? Okay, so he wasn't spending enough. When does this nafaqah get waived? Okay, number one, it can get waived بالتراضي. They're both agreeing. It's like, you know what, you don't have to pay anything, which is similar to al-misyar. She said, you know, I'm actually a rich woman. Don't worry about all the expenses. I got it covered. Okay, well, thanks. That's very nice of you. Okay, what about another time? Well, the nafaqah or the financial maintenance could also be waived by the court order. All right, but here's one thing. If we're talking about by court order, can there be at any time that the spending or the amount that he was supposed to be spending that he wasn't spending, so she ended up needing to cover those expenses. She needed to pay perhaps maybe electricity bills, needed to pay all of that, and he was basically just sitting down, unemployed, didn't want to do anything, and she had to act. She decided, you know what, you don't want to do anything. The kids need clothes, the kids need food, we need electricity, we need gas, we need this, and he was just being careless and all of that. So she goes and basically on her own basically gets perhaps maybe borrows money from her parents or borrows money from somebody, and in order to cover these expenses. And he's basically being careless. He's like, okay, you know what? Thanks for borrowing the money, but I'm not going to pay it. I'm not going to cover any of that. So she can then raise it to the court and basically say, this is what I needed to borrow, and this is what he had not been paying. And then the qadi will say, this is going to be a debt upon you, mister. And she basically borrowed money to survive. Okay, that's the first opinion. The other scholars, they consider, well, she doesn't have the right to borrow money under his name, and that she would basically then the scholars basically debated that she would basically borrow the money, but then she would have the burden of proof, basically to prove that this amount was fair in the expenses, and then of course probably have the witnesses to witness that he wasn't paying and all of that stuff. And then we're talking about a dispute right there, and she would have the burden to basically prove all of that. And then just letting you know that the debate between scholars on that piece, and is the nafaqah at all waived? What if he basically was not spending enough? So he can get a second job, or at least another part-time job along with his full-time job, but he insisted that no, I can't handle this. And subhanAllah, especially during our times, I guess you would see a lot of boys and a lot of men are basically not living up to, I would say, being masculine enough and being strong enough to hold more than one job or basically work hard and all of that. So you would see many, they're basically mama's boy, and then they end up not capable of holding any tasks. But of course, that wasn't like before. It was quite interesting. Right now, we actually have studies that say that men's testosterone right now is lower than the testosterone men had quite a while ago in their when they were in their 70s. So in other words, men are becoming less manly. Yes, men are becoming less manly. Men are becoming less risky. Men are becoming more feminine. Men are becoming incapable, incapable of holding responsibilities like before. Men are becoming less incompetent in being an area of trust, basically to trust them perhaps to be the courageous men, the responsible men, the men to really be qawamun. I wonder if that's the interpretation of the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ, had said that there's going to come a time towards the judgment day that there will be one qayyim woman well to basically 50 men. So 50 men and one woman. You just wonder if that's basically talking about testosterone at all, or whether this is talking about wars, basically, I guess, killing so many men. The other day I was reading the Ukraine and Russian war had killed and basically costed 2 million lives. During our times, you would think, really, wow. Whatever. Let's see. Wow, we just said whatever on 2 million lives right there. Ya Allah. Okay, let's see. And of course, in the situation of him not being too committed, and in that situation, of course, he would have the responsibility to basically cover, and the nafaqah is basically what was considered in the contract, and in that situation, it basically, let's see, فلا يحتاج إلى الرضاء أو قضاء في صيرتها دينا. So that this is the majority. They basically said if he's not doing his job in making sure that all those expenses are covered, then in that situation, they said if he's not being responsible enough to cover their expenses, then of course this is going to be a debt upon him. And he doesn't have to consent to it. He doesn't have to say, oh, wait, let me consent if I'm going to accept that that's a debt upon me or not. You don't have to consent. We already know it is. The qadi will basically say it is, because you had not been doing your job in making sure that all the expenses are covered. And then of course the wife is going to basically prove, did he do his job, or is he just, I'll just let the unemployment cover everything. It's barely covering, and he's not even looking for a job. Okay, let's see. Majority of the scholars, they basically said in nafaqah, or the financial maintenance, was actually something that was obligatory in the Quran, Sunnah, and even consensus between scholars, and therefore nothing can waive it. Even if he had probably some debt to pay off, or probably some rent to pay, etc., because at the end there are certain expenses he has to do the right money management, and therefore the qadi would basically have the right to evaluate in this circumstance and basically judge whether he is responsible or is not responsible. But one other thing to mention here, you could see that the different courts throughout times, we're speaking about, let's say the wife didn't raise it until 3 years later, and 3 years later she comes to the qadi and she says, he owes us, so we're talking about maybe $120,000. Wait, how did you get to the number $120,000? Oh, it was $60,000, this, and I've got the bills and all of that. And why did it take you 3 years to raise this matter? Why did it take you 3 years to raise this matter? Why didn't you object to it from the beginning? $120,000 is a lot of money. So in that situation, of course, the different courts, they basically had different, I guess, different consideration on when this should be risen and how long back it will basically, let's say, date to which date is it going to basically go back to, and then consider all of this. consider all of this later on to be a debt to pay. And in other words, is it going to be 1 month? Is it going to be 3 years? Is the maximum to basically raise it in that? Of course, you could see, different madhab on in this regards, but just to let you know, of course, there isn't a specific ruling on this. And of course, the qadi is going to decide at that time, basically, on what is and how far back will this qadi decide that, yes, you were laid off on this date, and since then, there were a number of expenses. So we're going to consider the expenses, at least 2/3 of the expenses that you used to pay while you were working. Did you do something about it? You didn't. How long had you not been working for? I hadn't been working for, let's say 2/3. And did you get unemployment? How much of unemployment did you get? If you didn't get unemployment, what did you do about it? Did you make any money? Did you have a paycheck? Did you make anything at all? No, I didn't. Well, what did you do to cover the expenses of food? At least 2/3 of that needed and necessary coverage. What did you do about it? I didn't do anything. So what did you at least borrow money? Did you go to food shelves? Did you get any money right there? No, I didn't. So what did you expect that was going to happen? For sure, you're going to get an eviction notice. For sure, the kids are going to be hungry. What are you doing about it? Well, I didn't know what to do. I was actually going through depression that I got laid off. Well, sorry, this is not going to basically feed the kids. What you're going through is not going to feed the kids. It's going to put the kids basically ending up in a homeless shelter. You had to do something about it. And this type of, I was actually on going through depression. Islam tells you, hey, get up and figure something else and figure something out and figure, you can't just say, oh, I'm actually going through depression, therefore I can't do anything. And this is one thing, is that many times, there is definitely a number of different people that really are going through depression. They can't do anything. But at the same time, one of the key factors of why many will just think that they are entitled and that, oh, I'm basically going through depression, therefore I can't take care of myself, and I need somebody to clean my bathrooms, and I need somebody to clean my house, and is really lacking commitment, lacking responsibility, and lacking the training in learning how to be responsible from early childhood. Teach your children to clean up after themselves. Teach your children, and it becomes a wiring in the brain. Becomes a wiring in the brain. Why didn't you clean the bathroom? Why didn't you clean after yourself? How many times were you supposed to be taking a shower this week? What did you do? Why you ate? Why didn't you pick up your plates and put them on the dishes? Learn how to wash those dishes. Learn how to pick up your socks. Why does mom have to do it for you? If you basically don't teach them how to do that, then they're going to live entitled for the rest of their life. And certainly, when we're speaking about teaching responsibility, it becomes a wiring in the brain. Wire your kids with that wiring to act responsibly, to work, and to let basically this adrenaline move when they are going through a tough circumstance, rather than sit and just wait for some kind of a divine intervention to, I guess, bring them rizq or probably change their circumstances. No, you have to act, and you have to do what is necessary, and to teach them how to basically live under pressure. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the ability to live under pressure, especially if you're a man. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you that ability. So make sure that kids actually learn it from early childhood. Learn how to live under pressure, or else when you're really under that pressure, you're going to end up, I'm under depression, I'm going through anxiety, I need someone to basically bring a divine intervention. Ain't gonna happen. It's not gonna happen. We need to man up our children and man up our kids. And basically, our daughters also need to teach them how to live in different circumstances. Learn how to knead the dough if that's the only thing that you're capable of doing. Learn how to fix and sew your clothes, and learn how to basically do your own stuff. Don't necessarily expect that you would always have a maid. Teach your daughters how to be responsible, and teach your boys how to be, let's call it, ultra responsible. this is it. I know you all have to go to sleep. So inshallah, we will consider right there, inshallah. I could say the numbers are really dropping. People are really getting tired of this. What I'll do, I'll basically be giving this class at another time and continue with our tafsir. But inshallah, I'll be announcing the fiqh class at another time because definitely the students, those ladies are basically overwhelmed with fiqh. So I'll basically be doing the fiqh classes at another time. So, look out for, I guess, whether it's the live stream or whether it's the announcement. You'll see one time I'm like, okay, I'm ready to give my fiqh right now, and I'll just basically announce it. I know some of you are going to be sleeping, some of you are going to be awake, but I mean, at the end of the day, we basically have to complete this in putting it in and put it in our Fiqh of Marriage library. We're almost done, but inshallah, we'll make sure that we don't also lose our tafsir students, because I could see that many are overwhelmed with the fiqh. I know it's a very hard topic to digest. It really needs, I consider it the math and the physics of Islam. So definitely, I know it's not easy. Thank God we don't all have to be judges, and thank God we don't all have to be, experts in fiqh, but it's really important to learn. And, inshallah, take the time to study all of this because it will benefit you. It will benefit you, and it is really, really worth it. Okay, let's see right here. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. MashaAllah, we've got, let's see, we got committed sisters right there. And inshallah, you can unmute yourselves if you want. You can ask a question or probably give a comment, or maybe even, correct something if I misread something or probably confused something. Hey,